You're recording.
On behalf of San Joaquin College of Law, I'd like to welcome you to the LSAT Prep online forum. My name is Diane Steele. I am the Director of Admissions for San Joaquin College of Law. We're excited to bring to you this LSAT Prep night online. To begin with, please turn off your video. Thank you. And we will also be muting your microphones as well. If you do have a question throughout the presentation, just push the raise hand icon and we'll do our best in the chat section to answer your questions along the way, as well as we'll have a question and answering period at the end of the presentation. The LSAT presentation will be led by San Joaquin College of Law Adjunct Professor Andrew Kucera. And Professor Kucera will begin with a PowerPoint sharing information about the LSAT and how best to prepare and some strategies to share with you. And then he will walk you through some sample questions on our whiteboard electronically here. So we're super excited to welcome Professor Kucera. We're grateful for him to do this presentation, and I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce himself and begin our training. Thank you.
Can I turn that to me, or do I need to sit here?
I would sit because otherwise the ceiling shows clock.
Because I'm also going to want to control the
Yeah,
PowerPoint.
Then you certainly can. Just do an intro and then you can do whatever you want.
Hi, everybody. My name's Andy Kucera. I'm adjunct professor here at San Joaquin College of Law, and I'm going to be presenting this afternoon or tonight on our LSAT forum. So the format of tonight is going to be, we'll run about 2 hours and we'll have a 10-minute break in between. The first half hour is going to be a PowerPoint presentation that's a little bit of information about the LSAT. And then the balance of the afternoon is going to be going through some specific logic games questions that are from past LSATs, so you can get a feel for question types and question strategies and things like that. So should I turn that and go there, or do you want to?
Whichever.
Okay, so we're going to try. All right, so hopefully everybody can still see me. I'm going to share my screen in a moment, which is going to have a short PowerPoint presentation about the LSAT. This presentation is meant to be interactive, so if you have questions, you can either raise your hand in the Zoom meeting. There should be in the participant box a little option to raise your hand, and if you do that, I'll see it, and then I can call on you. And the other thing you can do is just type a message in the chat box, and I will see that also, and I'll be able to enunciate the question for everybody and answer it. So we'll have time at the end for question and answer also, but if you have a question during the presentation, we have plenty of time for this, so just go ahead and either raise your hand or type in the chat box. And I see we have 2 more participants that have just joined us. Nathalie, welcome, and Jennifer, welcome. Glad to have you with us. So here goes. All right, so this is our presentation on the LSAT, which of course stands for the Law School Admissions Test. What is the LSAT? The LSAT is a half-day standardized test required for admission to most law schools, and it's used to assess law school applicants. Important to mention that it's not the only thing that's used to assess law school applicants, but it's one very important one. And so Javier or Diane can tell you about all of the other things that we use to assess law school applicants and all of the other important components of your application package. But tonight we'll be focusing on the LSAT. Let's see if I can get it. Oh, I can't. Just going to try and get that window back. Why do law schools require the LSAT? The most important reason is it measures skills that are considered essential for success in law school. And those three skills are also the names of the sections that you'll see on the LSAT: reading comprehension, analytical reasoning, and logical reasoning. And analytical reasoning, of course, is the official name for the logic games section of the LSAT. So what's in the LSAT? It's 5 35-minute multiple choice sections. So do the math. At 5 times 35 minutes, you're about 3 hours of testing with breaks. Within that 3-hour period, you have one section on logic games, one on reading comprehension, 2 on logical reasoning, and 1 experimental section. And I think the experimental section probably bears some explanation. An experimental section will be just like one of the other sections, either logic games or reading comprehension or logical reasoning, but you won't know which one is the experimental section. So in other words, you might have a LSAT with 1 logic game section, 1 reading comprehension section, and 3 logical reasoning sections. And if you have that, you know one of the logical reasoning sections is experimental, but you won't know which one. Don't spend any time trying to guess which one, because they'll look too similar and there's really no point in trying to figure that out. The purpose for the experimental section is so LSAC, the Law School Admissions Council, which is the organization that administers the LSAT, can test questions online in real LSATs and determine their suitability for use in a future LSAT. So that's the reason for the experimental section. And then last, 1 35-minute writing sample. The writing sample used to be done in conjunction with the LSAT when it was done in paper booklets. Now that's taken offline at a different time where you have an online proctor. So the writing sample is done at your computer at home or something like that. The writing sample is not scored, but it is sent to law schools for consideration. And law schools treat writing samples differently. One of the things I like to say about the writing sample is it will not guarantee your admission to law school, but it could guarantee your non-admission to law school if you write a very poor one. So you want to make sure and pay attention to the writing sample and do as good of a job as you can. How is the LSAT scored? You have about 100 scored questions on the LSAT. The number that you get right out of 100 is converted to a scaled score of between 120 and 180. So one of the important things there is that because it's only based on the number of questions you get right, there's no penalty for guessing. So whether you get a question wrong or you don't answer the question at all, it counts the same. It's only the number that you get right. So the number that you get right out of 100 is converted to that scaled score. And the reason for conversion to a scaled score is to mitigate the effects of slightly different difficulties in administrations of the LSAT. So in other words, it doesn't matter which LSAT you take, whether you take one this April or 10 years ago, if there's a slightly different level of difficulty between those tests, then that's accounted for in the scaled score. So that makes it so that law schools can consider a scaled score without having to consider which administration of the LSAT you took. An important metric with LSAT scoring is percentile ranks. And so a percentile rank is the percentage of students or test takers that scored better than you or worse than you on the LSAT. So for example, if you are in the 40th percentile, that means that 40% of test takers scored below you and 60% of test takers scored above you. And if you see on the slide, the 40th percentile is a scaled score of about 149, which is about 54 questions correct. Now, important to point out here that a 149 is not a bad score on the LSAT, and you only need to get 54 questions right to get a 149. So if you get 54 questions right, that means you're getting 46 questions wrong. So that's a lot of wrong questions that you can still get and still get a decent score on the LSAT. Another thing to point out is how much you advance in terms of a percentile rank for a correspondingly low increase in your scaled score and your number of questions right. So if you go from 54 questions right to 58 questions right, you jump a full 10 percentage points in your percentile rank. So 10% of the test takers of the LSAT, you jump ahead of them just by getting 4 additional questions right. And then of course, the 60th percentile there is a scaled score of about 154, which is about 63 questions right. So that's a little bit about the scoring of the LSAT. Bear with me just a moment, and I'm going to try and see if I can get my chat box back. Oh, here we go. So I'm going to allow everybody to unmute themselves. So if anybody has questions at this point, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Or I'll see if I can get my chat box and
You unmute all.
only if they want to be unmuted. I did check it so that they can unmute themselves if they have questions. But I don't know where my chat box is. Is it more up chat? Okay, so I have a question here. Is there a certain amount of time that one can take the LSAT? Natalie, do you want to clarify that question a little bit? Oh, a certain amount of times. So that's a really good question. And the answer is, it depends on the law school. So the Law School Admissions Council will let you take the test as many times as you want. But law schools will treat your scores differently. So some law schools will take only your first LSAT score. Some will take your highest LSAT score, regardless of how many times you take it. Some will average your LSAT scores. So it depends on the law school. And Diane here at San Joaquin, what do we do as far as which LSAT score we take?
We take your highest.
Okay, so San Joaquin will take your highest LSAT score. So important, even though we'll take your highest score, law schools do get all of your scores, even if they say they only take the highest one. So they will see all of the times that you've taken the LSAT and all of the scores that you get. Does that answer your question, Natalie? Excellent. All right, so if anybody has other questions,
Javier has something.
Javier, do you have a question? You have your hand raised. You should be able to unmute yourself. I made it so that participants can unmute themselves. So Javier, if you want to ask your question, you can type it into the chat box or you can unmute yourself. All right, Javier, if you have, oh, it doesn't allow you. Okay,
Yeah.
I will unmute you.
Okay, sorry about that. Wasn't allowing me. So one thing that, if I'm reading the question correctly too, Natalie, is that LSAC came up with new rules starting this past September. So an LSAT test taker can only take the LSAT 7 times in a lifetime. That means that you are only allowed from LSAT now to take it 7 times only. In one administration year, LSAC will only allow that one LSAT test taker to take the LSAT 3 times in that year, an administration year. And the administration year goes from July to June. And it works kind of academic year. So July 2018 to June 2019. And those are the new rules that they just established this past September.
Great, thanks, Javier. All right, so if anybody has any other questions, oh, there's another question. Is there any news about the April administration? Do you have any updates there, Javier? I assume, Jennifer, you mean as in, will it be held? Yeah, so Javier says there's no updates right now about April. But I believe, Diane, you said in the beginning that today is the last day to change your test date from April to June if you want to change it from April to June.
We have heard that they're planning to get something in place and hope to inform us all by April 10th for the April LSAT.
All right, so Jennifer, that's everything we know right now. But I would encourage you to stay in touch with Francisco about that because he should be getting updates as soon as they come out. Okay, so let me get back to a couple more slides. And again, if anybody has questions, just raise your hand or post it in the chat box. Reading comprehension section measures your ability to read with understanding and insight. Examples of lengthy and complex materials similar to those commonly encountered in law school. And so again, these are explanations of the sections and why there's a similarity between doing well on the LSAT and doing well in law school. And also doing well as a practicing attorney, because the skills between those 3 things are consistent. Logical reasoning section assesses your ability to analyze, critically evaluate, and complete arguments as they occur in ordinary language. And I think, did I miss one of them? Oh yeah, the logic game section measures your ability to understand a structure of relationships and to draw logical conclusions about that structure. And that's the section that we're going to be working with this afternoon. All right, so 3 things that are important on the LSAT. Mastery, timing, and endurance. And mastery deals with your skill level in answering the questions correctly. And that sounds obvious. And the timing and endurance are a little bit less obvious, but mastery comes from just lots and lots of practice, understanding and learning the question types, the strategies for those question types, and then lots and lots of practice. So mastery is what you would think of your skill level on the LSAT. Timing is an important strategy also. The LSAT is a timed test. You only get 35 minutes for each section, which turns out to be about, what, 1.3 minutes per question. And so there are some timing strategies that you could and should be using. One is that not all the questions are presented in order of difficulty. So the LSAT tends to play around a little bit or contrive the difficulties of the questions. So they may have some more difficult questions early on and some easier questions at the end to try and get test takers that don't have the timing strategy down to get them bogged down on difficult questions and not make it to easy questions at the end of the section. So that also comes into play in reading comprehension and logic game sections, is that not all of the reading comp passages and logic games are presented in order of difficulty throughout the section. So you might want to take a few minutes, maybe a minute or so at the beginning of each section to look over the games or the reading comprehension passages and decide what order you want to tackle those in. And then endurance is an issue because you're going to be spending more than 3 hours taking this test, and your endurance is your physical body and your mind reacting to taking a 3-hour test. And everybody responds to that differently. So if you practice full-length LSATs, then you will build that endurance so you have the mental and physical stamina to take the test for 3 or 3.5 hours. And so that's a really important strategy also. So getting into logic games a little bit, which is what we're going to be talking about this afternoon. There are 4 different game types and then some combinations. And the easiest one generally is sequencing. In a sequencing game, you're ordering or ranking entities. In a selection game, you're choosing a smaller group from a larger group. In a matching game, you're matching 2 kinds of entities to each other, or you're matching attributes of one entity to the entity. And then distribution is separating entities into groups, like taking a larger group and creating smaller groups. And then there are also hybrid games, which are generally more difficult. And hybrid games are a combination of 2 or more of these other game types. Now, you may not see all game types in every LSAT. There's typically at least 1 sequencing game, and there's typically at least 1 hybrid game. But the others you may or may not see. And it probably bears at this point mentioning that the reason that we focus on logic games at this LSAT seminar is because in 2 hours, I can teach you something useful about logic games, but to do that with reading comprehension or logical reasoning takes much longer than 2 hours. And so, I like that in the 2 hours we have together, we can cover a little bit of information about the LSAT, and then I can teach you something useful that you can take home and actually do better on the LSAT because you've attended this. If we tried this with reading comp or logical reasoning, probably all we would do is get deep enough to confuse people, and that's not our goal. So these are the different logic games types. Tonight we're going to start with the sequencing games, and we'll get through a couple of those, and if we can get to some of the more difficult ones, we will. There is a strategy for every type or every subject area on the LSAT, and our strategy for logic games has 5 different components. The first one is the overview, and I'll go through these in more detail when we're working on the games. But in the overview, you are going to read the introductory paragraph of the game. You want to learn the game types, because when we read the introductory paragraph, we're going to be identifying what type of game it is, because we have different strategies for different game types. The second step will be to draw a picture, and that will be what we call your master sketch, which is the diagram of how the game is going to work out. The third step is to read the rules, which are the little indented portions underneath the introductory paragraph. And the rules essentially are the constraints by which the game operates. And the fourth step, which is the least obvious but the most important, is to make deductions. And making deductions is about combining rules to determine what else must be true. And we'll do some of that this afternoon. And then last is answer the questions. And so that's when you actually look at the questions and the answer choices. And there are different question types within logic games. So we'll be learning some of those question types tonight for the logic games. All right, so we're going to get started on a couple of games. Does anybody have any questions before we get started?
Javier said they can't talk unless you unmute them.
Okay, if anybody wants to unmute themselves to ask a question and can't, let me know and I will unmute you or just raise your hand. We're still getting the hang of Zoom over here. All right, so I'm going to move around a little bit and we're going to switch the screen over to a whiteboard that I can use. Is this where we got it? Maybe not. This one. All right, so I'm going to share a screen with you, and that's going to be our whiteboard. And I'm hoping everybody has a packet, either print or electronic, that has a list on the top. Javier, do you want to let us know if the camera is okay from what you can see, just so everybody can see me? So you should have a packet that has 10 logic games questions in it, and then a cover page that has citations for each question. And the citations, where it says a PT number, section number, and game number, the PT number is a practice test number. And so if you go purchase LSAT resources like books or anything like that, the PT number corresponds to a year and month that the LSAT was administered. And you can look that up and find this exact game in a book. And then lots of aftermarket companies will publish answers and explanations, and you can use those citations to look it up. So we're going to start with the first logic game in the packet, which has a number 3 and triangles at the top, and it starts with 6 entertainers. And so let's, I'm going to duck behind the camera, and we are going to get a whiteboard here. All right, so if anybody has trouble seeing the whiteboard, just raise your hand or post into the chat. But this is an electronic whiteboard where I can draw out some of the questions. And again, if you have questions while we're doing this, just feel free to raise your hand or unmute yourself or type a question into the chat box. So our first question says, 6 entertainers, Robinson, Shapari, Tige, Wu, Yeaton, and Zane, are being scheduled for the 6 performances on the opening day of a community festival. Each entertainer will perform at one of 6 times: in the morning at 9 a.m., 10 a.m., or 11 a.m., or in the afternoon at 2 p.m., 3 p.m., or 4 p.m., with no 2 entertainers performing at the same scheduled time. The order in which the entertainers perform is subject to the following constraints. So that's our introductory paragraph, and we're doing our overview, the first step of our strategy. And so in the overview, we're trying to determine what type of game this is. And we don't have all the tools right now, but I will tell you that it's a sequencing game, and the reason is because we're ordering or ranking entities. And we're ordering them because we have time slots that are numbered, 3 in the morning and 3 in the afternoon. So this is a sequencing game. And the next step is to draw a sketch. And this is typically what our master sketch would look like for a sequencing game. Let's get a color that's going to be really visible here. And what we're going to do first is just list our entities up at the top. So we have Robinson, Shapari, Tige, Wu, Yeaton, and Zane. Get rid of some of that. So those are our 6 entities, and then we're going to have 6 time slots. And so this is, oops. Nine, 10, 11, those are our morning time slots, and 2, 3, and 4. So that's what our master sketch is going to look like with 6 time slots and our 6 times. So that's our second step of the strategy, is draw our master sketch. Now, in any sequencing game, generally what your sketch is going to look like is just a series of spaces or dashes where you can write in the entities. And we're usually ordering them or ranking them. And then a list of the entities at the top. Will we be able to tell if they have questions?
Javier's going to text.
Ah, awesome. All right, so step 3 in our strategy is to read the rules. And what we're going to do when we read the rules is we're going to write them down in shorthand or draw them into our master sketch. And so the first rule says, Robinson must perform at some time before Zane. So the way I would do that is an R with a dash and then a Z. And that simply says that R has to come before Z. Now, we don't know where they're going to be in the sketch, at least at this point, but we know wherever they are, we have to have R first before Z. The second rule says Yeaton's performance must be the next performance after Wu's. So this is kind of similar to the first rule, but a little bit different. So W and Y, W has to not just come before Y, but it has to come immediately before Y. And the way I would represent that is a WY with a block around it. And anytime you have 2 or 3 entities together that have to be next to each other, that's called a block of entities. And blocks of entities narrow down how the game can work out. The third rule says T game must perform in the afternoon. And the way I would represent that is probably just to put in a T and then maybe a curly Q like that, so we know that T has to be in the afternoon. And then the last one, Zane must perform in the morning, which is similar. So we could put Z in the morning. Now you might notice that we've gone through all 4 rules and we still don't have S anywhere in our sketch. There's a word for that, and I'll just draw an asterisk next to the S. S is what's called a floater. And a floater is an entity that doesn't have any rules that govern where it's going to be in the sketch. So this will come up a little bit later, but essentially there's fewer constraints on floaters. They can move around a little bit more. All right, so the question now is, once we've read and interpreted the rules and have them written down in shorthand, whether we can combine any rules to find out what else has to be true. Does anybody have any suggestions of ways that we could narrow down how the game can work out? Is this telling me we have bear with me just a moment. I think I can do it with these boxes up.
Okay.
All right, so for example, we have a rule that implicates Z, that Z must be in the morning, and then we have another rule that implicates Z, where R has to be before Z. So under one rule, Z could be in the 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, or 11 o'clock slot, but R has to come before Z. So Z really can't be at any of the morning spots. It can only be at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. So the way I might do that is change this representation for Z and put Z in either 10 or 11, because Z can't be at 9 o'clock. Now, the next question is, if Z has to be at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock, where can R go? Because R has to go before Z. So if I asked if R could go at 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 2 o'clock, the answer would be no, because R has to come before Z. So R has to be in one of these two places, 9 or 10. So R before Z, either R is at 9 and Z is at 10, or R is at 10 and Z is at 11. And some of you might find this as being really easy to figure out. Some of you might find that very difficult. But that is essentially an example of making a deduction, taking two rules and combining them to find out what else must be true. Now, when you go to answering the questions, it's going to be much easier to figure out what the answers to the questions are when you make deductions like this. All right, so let's take a look at the questions now, because those are the only deductions that we can make in this game. So the first question says, which one of the following could be the order from first to last in which the entertainers are scheduled to perform? So in the beginning, I mentioned one of the reasons we do logic games is because in a fairly short period of time, I could teach you something useful. So remember this right now, because when you get to the LSAT, this will be a free point on the LSAT. This question type is called an acceptability question. And the reason it's called an acceptability question is because it's asking you what is an acceptable combination or an acceptable ordering or ranking of the entities. So the right answer is going to have a list of entities that don't violate any of the rules. And the four wrong answers are going to have a list of entities that violate one or more of the rules. And that question type is called an acceptability question. And it's just asking you what is an acceptable outcome of the game. Now, you don't have to get any of the deductions to get the acceptability question right. Our strategy for an acceptability question is take the rules and apply the rules to the answer choices one at a time. So if you're working ahead of me, you can go ahead and try that. And I'll do it right now, but purposely a little bit slowly to allow you to work ahead. But take each individual rule and apply it to the answer choices and see which answer choice violates that rule. So for example, the first rule says, Robinson must perform at some time before Zane. Do we have an answer choice that violates that rule? And I see A and B and C are all okay. D is okay. Answer choice E has Zane before Robinson. So answer choice E is wrong. And rule number one is going to eliminate answer choice E. And then just go down the list. Yeaton's performance must be the next performance after Wu's. That's the WY block. So now the question is, which answer choice violates the WY block? And if you're looking at the answer choices, you'll see that that's answer choice D. Because answer choice D has Wu, Tige, and then Yeaton. W and Y are not in a block. So answer choice D is incorrect. The third rule says T-gay must perform in the afternoon. So look for an answer choice that has T-gay performing in the morning. And that answer choice is C. So answer choice C is wrong. And then the last one, Zane must perform in the morning. We only have two answer choices left, and one of them has Zane performing in the afternoon, which is B. So the correct answer to question 1 is A, because answer choice A is the only answer choice that doesn't violate any of the rules. So you can see that the strategy for the acceptability question is pretty simple. It's just read the rules and apply them to the answer choices. Now, one interesting thing to note with the rules and the answer choices is that there's 4 rules in this question, and there's 4 wrong answer choices. And each rule knocks out one and only one of the answer choices. And it's not the first time I've seen that on the LSAT. So that's just simply testing your ability to read and interpret all 4 of the rules in the questions. So the right answer to question 1 is A. That's an acceptability question. Regardless of how hard the game is, the strategy on the acceptability question is the same. So hopefully that's a free point for you when you get to your LSAT. All right, question 2. We're at about 5 minutes to the hour, so I think what we're going to do is go through these next 4 questions in this game, and then we'll take a break after this game before we start the next one. So question 2 says, if Wu is scheduled to perform in the morning, then which one of the following could be true? So this question type is called a new if question. And the reason it's called a new if question is because it has a statement that begins with if, which is a new rule for this question only. So we're going to go back to our LSAT strategy and start with step 2, which is read and interpret the rules. And so we're going to write down this new if as if it were a new rule for this question only. So because I have a digital whiteboard, I have the luxury of writing in different colors. So we're going to do this in red so you can see the difference. Now, our new if says, if Wu is scheduled to perform in the morning. All right, so now we have Wu has to be in the 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, or 11 o'clock spot because that's our new rule. Wu is scheduled to perform in the morning. Now, before we get to looking at the answer choices, remember we need to follow our LSAT strategy. And after reading and interpreting the rules, the next step in our LSAT strategy is to make deductions. So if we combine this new rule we have with our existing rules, then we can determine how the game is going to work. And if you combine our new rule, which is W has to perform in the morning, with our block of entities that W and Y have to be in a block, you'll see that the only place that you can put that WY block is in the 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock spot. Because if W goes at 9 o'clock, you have to have R and Z in the 10 and 11 o'clock spots. Same thing if you put W in the 10 o'clock spot. It's going to violate one of the other rules. So the only place that you can put Wu is at the 11 o'clock spot. Otherwise, it's going to violate some of the other rules. And then from here, just continue to follow the parameters of the game that you've already laid out. You know Z has to be at either 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock. So we can put Z in. you know that R has to be in either the 9 o'clock or the 10 o'clock spot. So you can put R in the 9 o'clock spot. And then really all you have left are T and S. S is a floater and doesn't have any rules. T has to be in the afternoon, but we don't know any more than that. So the way I would represent this is with a T, S, and a ST, and that simply means that one of those is S and one of those is T, but we don't know which one. So this is the power of making deductions. If we take our time with this step, then at least in this question, we have just filled in the entire master sketch with the exception of these two alternates. Now, when we go to the questions, we would expect it to be much easier to answer the questions, or at least find out what the right answer is going to be. So the question again says, which one of the following could be true? And it says Robinson is scheduled to perform at 10 a.m. Could that be true? No, because Zane is at 10 a.m. Shapari is scheduled to perform at 3 p.m. Could that be true? It could, because 3 p.m. is going to be either Tige or Shapari. So we can stop there. B is the correct answer. Now, I get a lot of times the question of, well, if we get the right answer, do we look at the other ones? And that's really up to you and how confident you are that that's the right answer. You know, I would probably stop there, but we can look at the others just to make sure. C says Tige is scheduled to perform at 2 o'clock. No, that can't be true because we have Yeaton there. Yeaton is scheduled to perform at 3 o'clock. That can't be true because it's either Tige or Shapari. And last answer choice E, Zane is scheduled to perform at 11 a.m. And that can't be true because Zane is at 10 a.m. So really making the deduction was key in this question. And it makes the question much faster and much easier. So I'll erase just the ones that we added for this question. Now I have the luxury of having a whiteboard, but when you are writing your master sketch, you're going to want to keep that and just do a little duplicate master sketch below. That you can use for each question. And again, if you have questions about anything that we're doing, just raise your hand or type a question in the chat box. Question 3. It says Shapari cannot be scheduled to perform at which one of the following times? This question type is called a non-if question. And the reason is because there is not a new if. There's not a new rule. And non-if questions are a little bit more difficult than if questions because if questions give you a new rule, and every additional rule tightens up the parameters of the game. A non-if question doesn't do that. So oftentimes the best strategy with a non-if question is to just test the answer choices and see what will work. And so 3 says, Shapari cannot be scheduled to perform at which one of the following times? The first answer choice is 9 a.m. So the way we would do this is we would just put Shapari in at 9 a.m. And then we would see whether or not the game works out. And in this case, if the game works out, then it's a wrong answer choice because we're looking for the time slot that Shapari cannot be scheduled to perform, right? So we're looking for, once we make the rest of the deductions, that the game can't work out. So we have Shapari at 9 a.m. and then we just follow along with the rest of our constraints. So R has to be at 10 a.m., Z has to be at 11 a.m., and then what are we left with? We're left with a WY block, and T. And of the 2, 3, and 4 o'clock spots, it doesn't matter where we put the WY block. T can go in the empty spot, and we don't have any problems. So the game can work out with Shapari at 9 o'clock. So that's a wrong answer choice. So we'll try the next one. And I will erase these. So answer choice B says 10 a.m. Well, let's see if Shapari can be at 10 a.m. We would then have to have R at 9 a.m. and Z at 11 a.m. And we have the same outcome with the WY block and T. So WY and T can go in any one of those 3 spots. So same with Shapari at 10 a.m. It's acceptable for the game to work out, so that makes that a wrong answer choice. Answer choice C says Shapari at 11 a.m. Well, let's see. We then have to have Z at 10 a.m., R at 9 a.m., and same outcome with the WY block and T. So if you were able to see that faster than I explained it, that's great. At 9 a.m., 10 a.m., and 11 a.m., all you're doing is moving around Shapari and R and Z. So now let's try answer choice D, which is 2 p.m. So if we put Shapari at 2 p.m., then what happens next? Well, we have R and Z, but they can go in the 9, 10, 11 o'clock spots. We do have this WY block that we need to be concerned about. And the WY block can't go in 9 and 10 because that would violate our rule. Can't go in the 10 and 11 o'clock spots because that would violate the Z rule. And if we put it in the 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock spots, then we violate the rule that T has to be in the afternoon. So there is not a way that the game is going to work out with S in the 2 o'clock spot unless we violate another rule. So that makes answer choice D the right answer, because Shapari cannot be scheduled to perform at 2 o'clock. Now, just to cover all the answer choices, answer choice E has Shapari at 3 o'clock. And if we put Shapari at 3 o'clock, then the game can work out just fine with WY, T, R at 9 o'clock, and Z at 10 o'clock. And in fact, if you look at this answer choice, it might look familiar to you because this was our answer to question number 2. And that brings up the idea of using previous work. So if you have an answer choice that's an acceptable combination of the way the game can work out, you can use that to help answer future questions. So because the game can work out, that makes E a wrong answer choice, and we're still left with D as the correct answer. All right, again, if you have questions, just raise your hand or throw up a chat in the box. Question 4, what is the earliest time that Wu could be scheduled to perform? Well, in our answer to question 2 and in our answer to question 3, I believe we had something like this. And that's an acceptable outcome of the game. And that should have been in your previous work for questions 2 and 3. So if we know from this acceptable outcome that Wu can be at 11 a.m., we can already from question 4 eliminate answer choices D and E. 2 o'clock is not the earliest, and 3 o'clock is not the earliest. And again, for a non-if question, our general strategy is just to test these out. But we can do a little bit of work up front, and we know we don't have to test out answer choices D and E because we already know that we have an acceptable outcome at 11 a.m. So what we would do next is just test it with W at 9 a.m. and see if the game can work out. Well, what's the problem here? Our WY block would violate the R rule. And if we put W at 10 o'clock, our WY block would violate the Z rule. So in fact, W can't be at 9 o'clock and can't be at 10 o'clock. And so the earliest it could be is 11 o'clock, which is answer choice C. Erase all my squigglies here. All right. So answer choice C is the correct answer for question 4. Last question, number 5. Which of the following is a complete and accurate list of the entertainers who must be scheduled to perform in the afternoon? So this is a special question type. This question is called a complete and accurate list question. How do you know that? Because it's asking you for a complete and accurate list. But really, you need 2 things in a correct answer choice. The list needs to be complete, meaning it has to have everybody it needs to have, and it also needs to be accurate, meaning it doesn't have anybody extra. And so this question is asking, which is a complete and accurate list of the entertainers who must be scheduled to perform in the afternoon? And we know the one answer choice we don't need to test is Tige. Why? Because we know that Tige must perform in the afternoon, but also because Tige is in every answer choice. So no matter which answer choice is correct, Tige is going to be in it. So we would just test the other entities. So for example, we could test Wu. Does Wu have to perform in the afternoon? And if you look at previous work, we can probably come up with an answer to that question. Because I think now we've had several questions that have this outcome. Oops. And this has Wu in the morning. So if that's an acceptable outcome, then Wu cannot be included in a complete and accurate list of the entities who have to be scheduled to perform in the afternoon. So we can then eliminate answer choices B and D because they contain Wu and they shouldn't. So that leaves us with answer choices A, C, and E. And let's look at, for example, Yeaton, who is in answer choices C and E. Does Yeaton have to perform in the afternoon? Well, we've been through this. So we can have an acceptable outcome of the game with the WY block in the 11 o'clock and 2 o'clock spots. But the problem with Yeaton performing in the morning is we can't move this block to the left, because if we move it, we would violate either the Z rule or the R rule. So Y does have to perform in the afternoon and then needs to be included in a complete and accurate list of the entertainers that have to be scheduled to perform in the afternoon. So that means that the correct answer has to be either C or E because it needs to have Yeaton in it. So what's the only other one we need to test? Is Shapari, because now we're trying to determine if the correct answer is C or E. So does Shapari have to be scheduled to perform in the afternoon? And I'll tell you something about this, and this comes back to Shapari being our floater. So it's very difficult to have constraints on floaters because floaters don't have any rules attached to where they have to be. So probably just looking at this from afar, it's unlikely that Shapari would be included on the list of entertainers who have to be in the afternoon. So all we need to do to figure this out is to find an outcome in the game where Shapari performs in the morning. And I think we already did this in one of our other questions. But we could have Shapari and R and Z, and then we could have in either combination our W, Y block, and T. And that's an acceptable outcome of the game with Shapari performing in the morning. So what that leaves us with is Shapari should not be included in a complete and accurate list of the entertainers that have to perform in the afternoon. And the correct answer then would be C, which is just Tige and Yeaton. So those are the only two entities that must perform in the afternoon. So, so that concludes question 5, and probably also a good time to take a break since it's about 1/4 after. Does anybody have any questions about that game or any of the questions in it before we take a break? I'll give everybody just a minute to either raise their hand or post a question if they have one. And so what we'll do for the next, about 10 minutes is we'll take a break. And if you have questions, we'll stick around. So we're not going to close the meeting. But if you have questions, either post a question in the chat box or raise your hand and we'll unmute you because I'll stick around for the break. So we'll pick up in about 10 minutes at about 25 after. All right, so we are back for the second half, or a little bit less than second half of our LSAT presentation. So we're going to get started on the next game on our list, which is the second question in your packet. And that is the question that starts with the detective determining the order of the criminal accomplices. So this one again has threes and triangles at the top. And we're going to tackle this one just like we did the last one. And that's going to be with our 5-step LSAT strategy, starting with the overview, which is reading the initial paragraph, determining the game type, and figuring out kind of who are the entities and what's going on in the game. So this one says, a detective is trying to determine the order in which a criminal recruited 7 accomplices: Peters, Quinn, Rivero, Stanton, Tao, Villas, and White. In addition to discovering that the suspect recruited the accomplices one at a time, the detective has established the following. All right, so what's our overview? We have a detective determining the order that criminal accomplices were recruited in. And because of that magic word order, we're sequencing because we're ranking or ordering entities. So what our stock sketch is going to look like, because that's always the second step of our strategy, is 7 slots for our 7 accomplices, and then a list of our entities. So we have P, Q, R, S, T, V, and W. So we have our list of entities, and we have 7 slots to put the entities in, and that's going to be our stock sketch. Third step strategy is the rules. So we're going to read and interpret the rules and write them down in shorthand. The first one says, Stanton was recruited neither immediately before nor immediately after Tao. So one of the things that you'll learn after practicing lots and lots of logic games is what's the most efficient way to represent the rules in shorthand. And with something like this one, I would write it as no TS or ST. In other words, S and T can't be next to each other. The second rule says Quinn was recruited earlier than Rivera. Well, we've seen a rule like that before, and that is simply Q with a dash and then an R. So Quinn was recruited earlier than Rivera. And then the third rule, Villas was recruited immediately before White. So again, that third rule looks a little bit like the second rule, but it's different. Instead of just earlier, it's immediately before. So we have a VW block. So that is a block of entities. And then the last one, Peters was recruited 4th. And we could just draw that directly into the sketch. If we want to number these, we could just put P in the 4th spot. All right. So now the question is, are there any deductions that we can make? And there's a number of different ways the game can work out, but it's difficult to make deductions in this game because we don't have really any rules that mention more than one entity, and deductions come from combining rules. And you can only combine rules when they have common entities. So this is a little bit unusual game where there are not any deductions that you can make up front when you do the master sketch. one of the comments I'll make about games like that is, in a game like this, we're probably more likely to see more if questions that give us new rules in the questions, because we don't have a whole lot of rules or deductions we can make up front. And the LSAT still needs to be able to test your ability to make deductions. And so that's probably going to come in this game in the questions. So question 1 says, which one of the following could be the order in which the accomplices were recruited from first to last? So again, like the last game, this is called an acceptability question. Now, not every logic game starts with an acceptability question, but that's a fairly common thing to happen on the LSAT. So again, acceptability question, you would tackle it the same way that we did the last one, which is simply read the rules and apply the rules to the answer choices and see if any of the answer choices violate the rules. And if you want to work ahead a little bit, you can start doing that. So take rule number 1, look through your answer choices and see which answer choices violate the rules. Now, there's kind of 2 ways to do this. One, as I've mentioned, is read the rule and apply it to the answer choices. The other thing you can do is you can take a single answer choice and look through your list of rules and see if it violates any of the rules. So that's just, you know, the inverse of the other. So it doesn't really matter whether you take the rules one by one or the answer choices one by one, as long as you're simply applying the rules to the answer choices and making that determination. So Stanton was recruited neither immediately before nor immediately after Tau. That's rule number 1. And that's our no TS or ST. And that, of course, knocks out answer choice A, because that has T and S together. Rule number 2, Quinn was recruited earlier than Rivero. That knocks out answer choice E, which has Quinn in the 7th position. Rule 3, Villas was recruited immediately before White. So you're looking for the answer choice that does not have that VW block. And that is answer choice B. And then the last one, Peters was recruited 4th. We're simply looking for the answer choice that does not have Peters in the 4th position. And that's answer choice C. So we're left with answer choice D as the correct answer. That's the only answer choice that doesn't violate any of our 4 rules. So again, acceptability question, apply the rules to the answer choices. You don't need to have made any deductions. And hopefully that's a free point for you on the LSAT. All right. Again, as always, if you have questions, just raise your hand or type your question in the chat box. Question 2, which one of the following could be the list of the middle 5 accomplices in the order in which they were recruited from 2nd to 6th? So this is a new question type we haven't seen yet. This is called a partial acceptability question. And it's like an acceptability question, but it's a little bit different. And the difference is, instead of being given the entire list or ordering or ranking of the entities, you're only being given a partial list. So in this case, we're only being given the 2nd through 6th accomplices. So there's an accomplice missing at the beginning of this list, and there's an accomplice missing at the end of this list. Now, the overall strategy is the same. So we need to find the answer choice that is an acceptable outcome of the game that doesn't violate any of the rules. But it's a little trickier because we have to think about which entities are going to go in those 2 missing positions, number 1 and 7. And so the way to do this is look at the answer choice, for example, answer choice A, and think about what 2 entities are we missing And where are they going to go? So in answer choice A, we're missing W, and we're missing R. And where are W and R going to go? Well, W has to go in the 7th position because V is in the 6th position, and V and W are a block. But R has to go after Q, and Q is in the 2nd position. So in order for the game to work out and this to be an acceptable list, both of our missing entities, right, R and W would have to be in the 7th position. And there's only one slot there. So answer choice A is incorrect. That cannot be an acceptable outcome of the game because it would violate at least one of the rules. So now look at answer choice B. What two entities are we missing in answer choice B? We're missing V and we're missing R. So R has to come after Q, so we could put R at the end, but where are we going to put our other missing entity, V? Remember, we have this VW block, and we have W in the 6th position. So answer choice B is going to violate that VW block rule. So answer choice B is incorrect. Answer choice C, who are we missing? We are missing R, and we're missing T. And where are R and T going to go? Well, R has to go after Q, so that would be in the 7th position. And we're missing T, and if T goes in the 1st position, that won't violate any of the rules because our only T rule is that T can't be next to S. So T couldn't be 7th, but we don't need T to be 7th, we need R to be 7th. So answer choice C is an acceptable combination of entities with T in the number 1 position and R in the number 7 position. So that is the correct answer, and that's an acceptable combination of the 2nd through 6th entities in the question. And if you go through answer choices D and E, you'll see that no matter where you place those two missing entities, they're going to violate one of those 4 rules. So partial acceptability question, usually a little bit harder than the acceptability question because you're not being given the full list of entities. All right, question 3. If tau was recruited 2nd, which one of the following could be true? So again, a new if question. This is going to give us a new rule for this question only. So it says if tau was recruited 2nd. So the way we're going to do this is go back to our LSAT strategy, read and interpret the rule, make deductions if we can. And so we're going to put tau in the 2nd position. Now the question is, where does everybody else go? We still have Q and R that we need to put somewhere, and S, and the VW. Now, the thing to pay attention to here, other than Q has to come before R, is that we have this VW block. And there's limited places that the VW block can go. And in fact, in this question, it can only go in the 5-6 spot or the 6-7 spot. So keep that in mind. Now, there aren't really any deductions we can make other than VW has to be to the right of P, and S has to be there also because S can't be in the 1 or 3 position. So really what we have to have over here is our VW block and S, or S and our VW block. I'm writing this above the slots because it has to be either this or this over here. And Q and R we can write those in, right? Those are the only places left for Q and R to go. So we haven't completely filled in the sketch, but we've done a pretty good job. So now the question says, if Tao was recruited second, which one of the following could be true? Quinn was recruited third. Could that be true? No, because that's R. Rivera was recruited fifth. Could that be true? No, because that's either S or V. Stanton was recruited sixth. Could that be true? No, because S has to be either fifth or seventh. Villas was recruited sixth. Could that be true? Yes, it could in this option number 2. And the last one, White was recruited third. Could that be true? And no, because R has to be third. So we know the right answer to number 3 is D. Villas was recruited sixth, because that's the only one that could be true. Any other answer choice would violate one of the rules. So again, that's a new if question, because it gives us a new rule for that question only. And again, our strategy for the new if question is read and interpret the rule, make deductions, and then answer the questions. So I'll take these off, and we'll look at the next one. Question 4. If Quinn was recruited immediately before Rivera, then Stanton cannot have been recruited when? So again, new if question, same strategy as last time. Read and interpret the rule and make deductions. So our new rule is Quinn was recruited immediately before Rivera. So now we have a QR block. Sorry, my QR block is a little messy. And that QR block replaces this QR rule. So before we go any further, what we're going to notice about our rules now is that we have 2 blocks of entities. We have a VW block and we have a QR block. And we still have P in the middle. And so one of those blocks is going to end up before the P, and one of those blocks is going to end up after the P. Which one, we probably don't know yet, because other than the 2 blocks, the only other rule we have is no TS or ST. So our answer choices say Stanton cannot have been recruited first. So we could try that. But this doesn't look problematic, because we could have QR, or we could have our VW, and then we could have the other block over here with no problems. So there's no problem with Stanton being recruited first. Can Stanton have been recruited second? Well, let's see. What's the problem with this? Well, we have 2 blocks of entities. We have a VW block and a QR block. And if Stanton is in the second spot, then there's no room for a block to the left of P. So just understanding that you now have 2 blocks of entities and one has to go on either side of P makes it impossible that you could put S in either the second spot or the 6th spot. But notice that the 6th spot is not an answer choice. So B is the correct answer. Stanton cannot have been recruited second. If you look at the others, 3rd, 5th, and 7th, that is 3rd, 5th, and 7th. Those are all spots that Stanton can be, because it would leave room for both other blocks of entities. And you also wouldn't violate your rule of no TS or ST. So B is the correct answer for question 4. So again, if anybody has questions, just type them in the chat box or raise your hand. And we'll move on to question 5. If White was recruited earlier than Rivero, and if Rivero was recruited earlier than Tao, then which one of the following could be true? So this looks like a really complicated question because we actually have 2 new ifs. But in fact, it's probably not a bad thing, and maybe even easier than just a regular if question, because we're going to get 2 new rules which add constraints to the game and maybe make it a little bit easier to make deductions. So again, same strategy, read and interpret the rules and make deductions. And so we'll take these rules one at a time. The first one says, if White was recruited earlier than Rivera. So that is, White was recruited earlier than Rivero. And then the other rule is Rivero was recruited earlier than Tao. So now combining rules. We can combine the VW block and the W before R, and we could just do this. So that combines these 2 rules. So we don't need that one also. And then we also have this rule down here of R before T. We could just add T here. And then we don't need this anymore. So now you can see we have our VW block comes before the R, comes before the T. And if you want to combine another rule, we could even add in our Q, which is from our QR rule. So we now have 5 of the entities in the game represented in a single rule. Now, the difficulty is, where is that going to go in our sketch? And difficult to tell other than you know the VW block is going to go to the left of P because there isn't room for it to the right of P, because R and T both have to be after VW and there aren't 4 positions to the right of P. So I don't know that we can do any more than just try out the answer choices. But let's take a look. It says if White was recruited earlier than Rivero and if Rivero was recruited earlier than Tao, then which one of the following could be true? Quinn was recruited first. Can this be true? Well, how else could we fill things in? We could put a VW block, and then we could put S and R and T. And does that violate any of the rules? We don't have T or S next to each other. We have Q before R, we have W before R, and we have R before T. So this looks like it doesn't violate any of the rules. Now, one of the important things to note is when we have this rule right here, we know that the VW block has to come before the R and the Q has to come before the R, but it doesn't say anything about what comes first between Q and the VW block. So those could be interchangeable. So this looks like an acceptable outcome of the game. It could be true. So that makes A the right answer. Let's look at the other answer choices just to be sure. B says Rivero was recruited third. What's wrong with that? Well, we have the VW block and the Q all have to come before the R, but there's only 2 empty slots. So that will not work. So answer choice B is incorrect. Now again, realize that this is made much easier by the fact that we have combined all 4 of these rules into one single rule. That's the power of making deductions. Answer choice C says Stanton was recruited second. Well, could that be true? The problem here is the only place to put the VW block is here, and there isn't room for R and T after VW. So that's not an acceptable outcome, and B is not the right answer. Or I'm sorry, C. Now let's look at answer choice D. Tao was recruited sixth. The problem with this is we have 4 entities that have to come before Tau and 4 slots, but only 1 left for S, and S would have to go 7th, which violates our no TS or ST rule. So that's not an acceptable combination. And last, answer choice E, Villas was recruited 6th. That causes major problems because our VW block is now at the end of our sketch and there's no room for R and T to follow VW. So E is not the right answer choice either. So that confirms that A is our right answer for question 5. All right, so now since those 2 if questions are for that question only, I'm going to erase all of this. In your test booklet or on your scratch paper, when you're doing this, you obviously wouldn't erase, you would just move on to a new question number and keep your previous work in case you need it. All right, question 6 says if White was recruited immediately before Quinn, which one of the following must have been recruited 6th? So again, a new if question, same strategy. But now we have White recruited immediately before Quinn. So that is a WQ, if I can draw a Q correctly. White was recruited immediately before Quinn. That's a WQ block. Are there any deductions we can make? We have a rule with VW and a rule with WQ. These 2 rules can be combined into a single rule with a block of 3 entities. VWQ. So now we have like a super block. And again, just to kind of be thinking ahead a little bit, there's only 2 places that that block of entities can go. It can either go here, or it can go here. So which one of the following must have been recruited 6th? Well, can we determine which one it is between these 2 options, 1 and 2? We have another rule here that implicates Q and R. So we could add R to our super block because R has to come after Q. Now we see that VWQ can't go here because there's no room for R. So we have to have VWQ. So remember, we're still in the stage of making deductions. Now the question is, are there any other deductions we can make? If R has to go to the right of P, the only place to put R is in the 6th spot. Why? Because we have R, S, and T, and we have a rule that says no TS or ST. So they can't go together. So we would have to have T or S on one side and the other one on the other side of R. So now let's look at the answer choices. Again, much easier after you make deductions. Which one of the following must have been recruited sixth? Quinn? No. Rivero? Yes. So B is the correct answer because Rivero has to have been recruited sixth. So I hope everybody sees that by combining the rules and making deductions, it makes evaluating the answer choices much easier. If you find yourself struggling on a question, it's most likely that you're struggling because you didn't get all of the deductions. So make sure and pay extra close attention to this part of the process when you're tackling these games. So that's the end of game 2. We're at just before the 3 o'clock hour. So we're going to wrap it up. And just a couple of items for closing. One is that I'm going to put my email address in the chat box. And you have 8 other games in the packet that we didn't get to. So if you want to try those games on your own, and if you want answers and explanations to those, I can send you those. Just send me an email. So I just put my email address into the chat box. Feel free to email me if you have any other questions about LSAT prep. Happy to answer those. And just one more calendar item to let you know about. The deadline for taking the LSAT for San Joaquin admission is June 30th.
The application deadline.
Oh, the application deadline is June 30th. So it's the end of March now. Make sure to get your application into San Joaquin by the end of June. And then feel free to, if you have questions now, post them in the chat box or raise your hand or unmute yourself if you can. I'm happy to stick around and answer as many questions as you have. If you don't have questions, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and happy that we could bring this to you, even though we can't do it in person. So thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Oh, I have a question here. What are the average score accepted by San Joaquin? I don't know that we have an average score, but Diane, maybe you could comment on what range of scores San Joaquin generally looks for from students. Sure, you can come on up and.
I don't know. You know what I think? It's dark.
Oh, is it better that way?
Yeah. I don't know.
You want me to move it here? Is that where it was before?
I don't know. Sure. All right. So the LSAT scores, they range from 120 to 180. San Joaquin College of Law likes to see a 150 or better. If you get close to that, if you're within reason to that 150, a 145 or better, the admissions committee will generally give you the benefit of the doubt. So you're really shooting for that 150, but if you're in those 140s, I would still submit your application, and hopefully there's other components to your application that will be strong. Any other questions for Andy or myself? While you're thinking, if there's any additional questions, I will just share with you that both myself and Francisco Rosas were happy to answer any questions about the application. We will be communicating with all of you what we learned from the Law School Admission Council as they make information available. We are assuming that the June 8th LSAT is still going to be a go, and we are accepting that for fall admissions for fall 2020. And are there any other questions, Andy? No.
I don't see any other questions. So thanks everybody. Have a wonderful day. And please contact us if you have questions after today. And thank you very much for joining us.